Let's talk about energy metabolism. Energy, and there is a thunderstorm going on, energy really is what we need to move. And our bodies rely on primarily chemical energy. We don't carry a lot of energy storage in immediate availability, but we have the very rapid ability to make it quickly. The source of energy that we use is ATP, and you'll see in figure 219 it has a really great cycle where ADP and phosphate, inorganic phosphate, will join together and produce ATP, and the breakdown of that phosphate off that ATP results in the production of energy. Breaking that phosphate bond is really what causes the ability or causes the release of energy for synthesis and work. Adenosine triphosphate is really an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphates, inorganic phosphates. There are 2 high energy bonds, and when those bonds are broken, the release of that bond is what causes the release of energy. ATP and ADP are interconvertible. They are exchanged very, very quickly. AMP is also available. We'll look at that later on. That can go back to ATP or ADP. The metabolic factory includes this figure 223, shows you how the macronutrients get broken, the macronutrients of protein, fat, and carbohydrate, how they contribute to the 3 energy cycles: aerobic energy system, anaerobic, and the phosphagen. You'll see that carbohydrates have a contribution to the anaerobic and the aerobic. Protein and fat, just the aerobic energy system. Because it's aerobic, it means with oxygen, so that particular system requires oxygen, and as that energy is made aerobically, there are products besides the production of ATP, and that includes carbon dioxide, water, hydrogen ion, and lactate. Those 3 components can move back into the blood and get removed from the body. Lactate can move between tissues. Carbon dioxide is going to be expelled through the respiratory tree, but we also have carbon dioxide in our blood. And the lactate can be also used to produce energy. We see the anaerobic system primarily results in the production of lactate that can be removed, and the phosphagen energy system is by itself, does not require any macronutrients, and it's readily available. All 3 energy systems result in that available ATP pool that allows us to do work. So what's different about the 3 energy systems? Well, the 3 energy systems in table 2.1 are listed in the first column. The second column gives you an idea about how quickly those systems can contribute to energy production. And so as you can see, the phosphagen system is 1 step, so it's quick. It's going to produce ATP really quickly. However, it's limited. It is initiated nearly instantaneous. And that's what we utilize when we start to move or at any type of movement. And it is very small capacity to make ATP. It's there just for high intensity or really quick needs. The anaerobic system has more steps. It is very quick. However, it also has a limited capacity to make ATP, which we'll look at a little bit later. And it takes a couple seconds to be at full bore. The aerobic system is more complex or more complicated. It doesn't produce ATP rapidly. However, it has a dramatic, it's much more, the capacity is much greater, so it's there for longer time of activity, and this is the system that allows us to do things for longer time frames. The phosphagen system is not really a pathway. The anaerobic system includes glycolysis. The aerobic system includes a number of metabolic pathways. And you'll see glycolysis under an anaerobic pathway and also the aerobic pathway. And so we talk about anaerobic and aerobic glycolysis. When you examine the macronutrient and where it lies, in which pathway, and how the order in which it occurs, the very first step in metabolism following phosphagen is glycolysis. Carbohydrates fit in glycolysis. Fats and proteins do not. So glycolysis occurs very quickly after phosphagen. It takes carbohydrates. Then carbohydrates will move to the citric acid cycle, and eventually where the majority of energy is made is the electron transport chain. Fats do not go into glycolysis. They must go under this process called beta oxidation, which is preparing it to fit into the citric acid cycle. So it has to be broken down or metabolized by beta oxidation. Beta means 2, and so it's broken down into 2 carbon chains. Then it fits into the citric acid cycle, and then it can make much more energy in the electron transport chain. Proteins, before they fit into citric acid cycle and electron transport, it has to be deaminated, and that means taking the nitrogen off the protein. So the amino acid has to be altered through deamination so it can then be converted into an intermediate in the citric acid cycle. As we look at these metabolism, the metabolic factory, you see again that you've got the proteins, fats, and carbs all going into aerobic system, carbs only anaerobic system. And the aerobic system includes glycolysis, beta oxidation, glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and tricarboxylic acid cycle, which is the same thing, in electron transport chain. Proteins and fats have to be prepared a little bit before they can jump into the citric acid cycle. So the phosphagen energy system involves creatine phosphate. And this is where we're going to look at creatine later on when we get to looking at strength and conditioning athletes. So creatine is part of that immediate energy system. It's not a metabolic pathway per se. It's just a transfer of a little phosphate, and the creatine phosphate the phosphate breaks off, produces energy, which then a phosphate can jump on that ADP and become ATP. Now ATP is in that pool and it's ready to be utilized. The phosphagen energy system is also known as the immediate or the ATP-CP system. how do the energy systems contribute to our ATP pool? Again, I'm going to remind you that the ATP pool is relatively small, but we have the capacity to fill it or to supply it very, very quickly. When we look at powerful short burst activities that would include just a big jump of energy, like a shot put or a jump, all three energy systems have contributed to that ATP pool. And however, you're primarily looking at your utilization of your phosphagen system to get that rolling. During short bursts of intense activity, a 100-meter run, so we think of a 400-meter lap of the track, 1/4 of that is going to be produce the energy that primarily contributes, the majority contributor is the phosphagen system. Remember, the anaerobic system is almost instantaneous, but we're looking at short bursts of all-out activity. That's going to be primarily your phosphagen system. For activities that are higher intensity but a little bit longer in duration, the systems are going to start to turn on. Phosphagen, readily available, but it becomes a very low contributor because it has to be recharged. So the next system is then contributing, and that's your anaerobic energy system, which is primarily glycolysis. Excuse me. Glycolysis is going to be the carbohydrate that's available to fuel that anaerobic system. Now, the anaerobic energy system is going to be able to turn on, work hard. However, its energy production is relatively low. Where we get the majority of our energy is through aerobic energy systems. So the aerobic is going to turn on, but it's going to be a very small contributor. Our primary contributing energy pathway is going to be the phosphagen, and then whoosh, our anaerobic system. Now you have activities that are long duration, non-steady state, 4 to 6 minutes. We still have our anaerobic energy contributing to our pool, but our aerobic energy system is going to be the bigger percentage contributor. Now we have longer duration activities of lower intensity, and we're looking at anything that you can do continuous for a longer period of time than a mile run or a fourth of a lap around the track. So the phosphagen and anaerobic systems are still contributing. However, if we look at percentage, the aerobic energy system is the big supplier. We understand that the intensity is lower than that burst of a jump, but it's something that can be sustained. So we have a contributing energy production. This shows you the continuum. You'll see this over and over in exercise physiology books. When we look at the phosphagen anaerobic systems on the far left and the aerobic system on the far right, we see the contribution of the energy system based upon intensity and duration. So you'll see that a boxing match is 50% anaerobic, 50% aerobic. And if you think about it, there are jabs, punches, quick bursts, but yet you have to have the ability to maintain that activity and kind of dodge and weave. If you're going to do a 2-mile run, you're still having the anaerobic system contributing, However, it's primarily aerobic that's doing the job. So in terms of intensity and duration, we have this relationship of contributing energy systems. This also is looking at the systems with intensity and percent ATP supplied by the different areas. So we have very high, moderate, and low intensity exercise. You look at the ATP contribution of the three systems. You'll see that the phosphagen system is the burgundy, and once you get, that's the primary energy source for ATP production. We see the blue as the aerobic system and how it slowly rises and it becomes the big representer of ATP production for lower intensity, and for moderate to high we have kind of an equal contribution from all three. So the anaerobic energy system starts with carbohydrates, and you see the glucose at the top. The glucose at the top, you'll see that there are 2 ATP that are required to start to metabolize that carbohydrate to get it in the right form so it can move forward. It gets split into 2 halves, and you have the production of 4 ATP. So you have the cost of 2, production is 4, 4 minus 2 is 2. So it's not a big producer for ATP, but it's quick and it can contribute for rapid, higher intensity activity. The aerobic system involves fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And you'll see the fats being broken down by beta oxidation, carbohydrates going through glycolysis, and proteins being deaminated. Proteins are able to fit in, you don't confuse, it doesn't fit into glycolysis. Pyruvate is the end product of glycolysis just before it gets into the citric acid cycle. So you have the contribution of all 3 systems potentially available. Pyruvate, which is the end result of glycolysis, if you are in a high intensity activity and pyruvate is the aerobic system is not able to turn on effectively, you're at a high intensity and you're not able to get enough oxygen in via the lungs, it's going to convert to lactate, and that shuttles away, but that allows glycolysis to continue. So you remove the product and allow the energy cycle to continue. The final process of getting glycolysis into the citric acid cycle is the formation of acetyl-CoA, and that requires oxygen. The citric acid cycle has a number of steps, and this is the representation. It appears always as a circle, but it's not truly a circle. It's just easier to view it as a circle. You'll see that there are some intermediate energy carriers noted as NADH, FADH2, and GDP. Those are ultimately going to be part of the ATP production process. And the citric acid cycle is occurring inside the mitochondria. I should have mentioned the glycolysis is in the cell cytoplasm. Carbohydrates are really important for an energy source. When you have low carbohydrate intake, muscle protein can be broken down, and that is where we have this deamination and ability for protein to be able to fit in as needed. So with especially longer duration activity, high intensity activity, we really need to have carbohydrates. So when you look at your nutrition coach question, which was at the beginning, we take a look at this and see, okay, now can I answer those questions that were asked? So this is an 800-meter track athlete who wants to eat a high-fat, high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet. And if we look back, the typical time for a high school, we're going to assume this is a high school athlete, that her time for running an 800-meter event is between 3 and 4 minutes, where a male would be slightly faster. If we consider that time, the energy system used would be primarily aerobic. It's a longer, lower intensity sprint with a longer duration, and so you want to peek back at figure 225. The aerobic system does use all pathways, but remember, everything starts with carbohydrate. So the carbohydrate requirement is going to be pretty high for this athlete. So you want to look back and say, is a high-fat diet really something that is going to be effective for this kind of athlete? What do you think?